the work of Inquisitor Dyer. Someone in mind. "My ladies, Captain," said Rostov, favouring each of them with a small bow of his head. He had a noble's bearing, Messinius thought, the easy movement of a man used to being in control. He was like Van Lescus in that regard, and Messinius himself, whose own family had been of some consequence. Athagay was the odd one out. She had the stiff, hyper-vigilant bearing of a powerful person who was not of those who were. "I thank you for joining me in this conference," said Rostov. He was calm to the point of coldness. He had very bright eyes, as Psyche's eyes, Messinius thought. He could feel the cold press of the man's mind. There was something reptilian about him. "I will endeavour to be brief," the Inquisitor went on. "For the less time we spend in talk and the quicker we move to oppose the enemy, the greater the chances of our success." As Messinius processed the small tensions within the group, he considered how long it would take the Primaris Marines to relearn human body language. Some existing Space Marines could not understand baseline humans at all. Though the White Consuls were closer to the populace than most, the process of apotheosis and the suppression of fear could strip a man of his emotions entirely, and the Primaris warriors were especially awkward. Van Lescus attempted to wrest control of the conversation the moment Rostov paused to draw breath. "You are here on a mission against the Crusade of Slaughter. Your seal is that of the Ordo Xenos," she said. "I understand that you are not completely restricted to one area of investigation, but it is unusual to find an alien hunter opposing the forces of chaos." "We all oppose chaos, my lady," said Rostov. He was almost impossible to read. Gilliman's assessment of Van Lescus was accurate. She was opinionated and unnecessarily pushy, almost aggressive. Messinius turned his helm fractionally towards the Inquisitor to watch his reaction. He found these interactions between mortals fascinating. "I am of the Ordo Xenos, yes," said Rostov. He was reserved, considered in the way he spoke. This was a man, thought Messinius, who only spoke when he needed to. Messinius used his sensorium to get a reading on Rostov's heart rate. Predictably, Rostov's pulse thumped along at a stone-cold 60 beats a minute. Van Lescus did not faze him at all. "What started as a simple investigation into the theft of and illegal trade in the substance known as Noctilith led me to the crusade sweeping through this sector." Rostov paused to allow further interruption from Van Lescus. It was challenge, not politeness. She raised her eyebrow, so he continued. "Your own agents will have informed you that the crusade heading towards Hydrafer is being trailed by a warp rift." "Interestingly," said Van Lescus, with a touch of a smile, "the first news of that came from you, though I have, of course, confirmed it. It is the Lord Gilliman's opinion that the War Master Abaddon intends to spread the rift further. I believe that the target is Hydrafer. This is not the isolated action of a Chaos warlord, but part of a greater strategy to overthrow order in the galaxy, specifically here an attempt to deprive us of this peerless bastion world. Should it fall, then the corners of the three segmenta will be at risk, and a corridor open for an attack on Terra itself from the Eye of Terror. Simple enough, though their manner of accomplishing it is bizarre." "Your reasoning is sound," said Rostov, "but your understanding incomplete. I suspect that the enemy's efforts are more coordinated than we think." "This is the greatest assault on the Imperium since the days of the Horus heresy," said Van Lescus. "Of course it is coordinated." "You do not understand all of it," said Rostov. "My master was Inquisitor Dyer. He long had an interest in Blackstone. It was through his own efforts to secure a supply of the material for study that we came across a network trading in finished artifacts of Xenos derivation." "The Mechanicus have been interested in this material of late," said Van Lescus. "They do not always respect the Lex. We understand study of this material has become most pressing to them since the fall of the Cadian pylons. What does it matter if the Martians engage in a little underhand exchange of Xenos material, if it eventually profits us all?" "Not a great deal," admitted Rostov. "And in many cases the trade was legal. The Adeptus Mechanicus have been actively mining raw Blackstone throughout this segmentum for well over 5 centuries. But vigilance is always called for in case Xenos artifacts fall into the wrong hands. And so, Dyer took it upon himself to monitor the industry in the sectors that he regarded as his own. He struck bargains with most of the major providers to do so, legitimizing their activities and allowing us to oversee it, intercepting examples of Xenos technology when we saw fit. We kept a wary eye out for those who could not be trusted with the Blackstone in any form, rogue magi in the main, several of whom we tracked down and executed, but there were others. Over time, we became aware of a pattern of trade that raised great concern. A portion of the finished material was vanishing. We traced this to a number of heretical cults, which we were successful in exterminating with aid from the members of the Ordo Hereticus. However, even successful, we rarely recovered the material, and it became clear some organizing influence was at work.
"But why? Why not just take it?" said Van Lescus.
Because that would have revealed the scale of their plans. According to my contacts within the Adeptus Mechanicus, the gathering has gone on for some time in secret. Whoever is assembling this Blackstone is interested primarily in Xenos tech, and they are gathering large amounts. I believe it has something to do with the means by which the Slaughter Crusade is creating this rift. More, I believe it goes further than that. This is the first instance we will see of this use of Blackstone. Sorcery is their usual means, said Messinius. These are followers of the Blood God, said Rostov. They despise psychers and sorcerers. My intelligence suggests that there is something else, that some of the larger Blackstone artifacts I and my master were tracking have been adapted into some sort of machine that can be used to open the veil between reality and the Empyrean. I mean broken pylons and other similar pieces, large pieces. Lord Gilliman told me something of this, said Messinius. After a long investigation, we discovered it to be true. I excruciated many of the cult members myself, said Rostov, and for the first time he showed emotion, a certain haunted look that flashed behind his eyes. One of them made mention of a being. The subject referred to this being as the Hand. In his ravings, before the pain broke his mind, he revealed that it was to this being that the Blackstone was being conveyed, all over the segmentum, and that gave me a hint of the scale of the Hand's intentions. Observe. Rostov held up his ring again. A pencil-thin beam of light projected a tri-D of a man strapped into a chair. He was streaked with blood, dribbling from several precise holes over major nerve clusters. Several of his teeth were broken. Messinius was taken aback by the primitive nature of the torture inflicted on him. From Rostov's fastidious appearance, he expected something cleaner, but this was the work of knives and hooked implements, of fists and gouging fingers, not pain engines or subtler devices.
"You'll see," the man was shrieking, "when the stars are drowned and the gods are in the ascendant, the great powers shall overthrow the false emperor. He has what he needs, and he is going to use it. Then," the man panted. He was close to death, but a triumphant leer formed around his broken teeth. "Then you will know what freedom is." The image went out. This information was difficult to secure. However, Dyer did not doubt its accuracy, and nor do I. "You learned nothing more?" Messinius asked. He found torture distasteful, dishonorable, and rarely useful. A man would say anything to end his suffering. "He expired soon after," said Rostov. "I performed a thorough psychic rip. He knew little more." "Then you are a psyker," said Messinius. Rostov nodded.
"Hand of whom, or of what?" said Van Lescus.
"That is the question I will have answered," said Rostov. "I must see this machine. If I can get close enough to it, perhaps I can divine something of its origins and ultimate purpose. Maybe we can return with captives who can be induced to tell us more." "That is a dangerous course of action," said Messinius, "but Lord Gilliman believes that the enemy's ultimate strategy is to spread the warp across the Materium. Any intelligence regarding the truth or otherwise of this theory will be of great interest to him. Then we shall do what we can to help him, for Inquisitor Dyer feared the same. Blackstone is certainly involved. The trail leading to this machine was not the only one. There could be other devices out there waiting to be used to saw open the Materium," said Rostov. "After we have retaken Makota, then I shall have my proof. Whether this is an isolated incident or part of a greater strategy, it cannot be allowed to continue. We must stop this machine, and it must be examined." "How should we proceed?" said Messinius. "Can it be targeted physically? Will conventional weapons work against it?"
Rostov glanced between the three.
"I have the means in my possession to stop it, and to reverse some of the damage done."
What means? Asked Van Lescus.
"Xenos tech. I will not tell you exactly what," Rostov said. "The fewer who know, the better." He returned to the cartolith. "This should be our highest priority in the campaign. I will send the Primarch a message as soon as we are victorious, and pass on all I have learned." "And if we all die?" Messinius said. "I have a sealed message ready for him, in case of that," said Rostov.
"I intend to take all Makota Sound," said Van Lescus fiercely. "I shall unleash the entire might of Fleet Tertius against this incursion, and it will be burned from the stars. It is time the heretics were reminded of who is the true power in this universe, and I shall have the great honor of delivering the Crusade's first victory."
"You must do as you see fit," said Rostov. "But to be frank, I do not care if it is Makota that burns instead of our enemy. All that matters is that device. It must be stopped, and if possible, studied."
"I have seen it," said Athagay, speaking up for the first time. "We all saw it, at Fomor. There is a ship, though it attempts to hide itself. I saw no device, but there was a ship towards the front of the rift. 2 attempts from Battlefleet Makota were made to destroy it. The first expedition got nowhere near it. No matter how fast they sailed, it was always the same distance away. The second task force vanished. This is no normal foe. It will be impossible to attack."
"I also know how to get to it," said Rostov. "Empirically charged Blackstone creates a resonance in the warp. There has to be a great deal of it to be traceable. It has to be active, and it can't be done from more than a subjective light-year away. But it is possible to lock onto it and follow it. We will track it, break warp on top of the machine, and take its guardians by surprise."
"Do you speak of sorcery?" asked Van Lescus. "Some of the Inquisition's methods are questionable. I know of radicals who will use any means. I will not tolerate the use of dark magics on my ships."
"Not sorcery. Rare sciences," Rostov reassured her. "I have plans for a machine that will help. This must be fabricated, and I require a navigator," said Rostov. "We shall need a volunteer. Following the machine's spoor will most likely kill the one who tracks it."
"You will need ships as well. A task force at least," said Van Lescus. "Possibly a battle group."
"I will," said Rostov. "I assume you intend a multi-pronged attack into the Makota sector?"
"The enemy are widely spread. It is the only way," confirmed Van Lescus.
"The main body runs ahead of the rift. If you can engage this with a larger portion of Fleet Tertius while we attack the device, then they will be drawn away and unable to defend it. I believe the enemy thinks this engine to be safe, and it is not in the character of the World Eaters Legion to spend their time on guard duty. This mission should fall within the wider strategy of the attack instead of being an isolated venture."
"Obviously," said Van Lescus haughtily. "So be it. We can come to an agreeable accommodation, I'm sure. A few diversionary attacks sent ahead of our main assault will add spice to the pot."
Van Lescus gave out a bark of laughter that made the long feathers in her hat jump.
"But what for argument's sake if I say no? Will you use your seal to requisition a fleet from me?"
"You would refuse? Then I will," said Rostov. His ringed hand went to the small bauble hanging from his chest, where resided the power of the Emperor himself. "But you won't."
"I cannot, can I?" said Van Lescus. "Not in all good conscience, and not without incurring consequences. Whether now or in a decade's time, the Inquisition will hold me to account if I turn you away."
"Yes," said Rostov, simply. "You would be defying the Emperor. Death would be the only just reward." Van Lescus snorted.
"Well, I agree anyway. Whether this grandiose theory is correct or not, the rift ship must be stopped. If you are wrong, and it is but a single wickedness that troubles the realms of mankind, it will have been removed. If you are right, then we shall have the upper hand against our foe and will have prevented the extension of the rift southwards."
"That is why this conference must remain secret," said Rostov. He looked at them all gravely. "We 4 are the only ones who know what I've discovered, that this ship is no random cruelty of the great enemy, but part of a structured plan. There will be agents of the enemy in Tertius, my lady fleet mistress. There are probably traitors among the men and women you brought here today, within striking distance of us, right now. All that separates us from victory and failure is this privacy field. When the forces you second to me move out to strike down this evil, they must remain in ignorance of what they hunt until the last moment. As long as the enemy remains sure they are safe, they are vulnerable. If they come to learn that I have a means of tracking this ship, or that I possess a way to deactivate their machine, then it will disappear. Secrecy must be our watchword.
Then you present me with a fait accompli as to who will perform this task, said Van Lescus.
She looked at the Commodore. I did already have somebody in mind, said Rostov. He gave a wan smile. Athagay stuck out her chin. Her head seemed small and frail, trapped between her cap and tall collar, but she was proud.
Strike Group St. Aster will do it, she said. For the Emperor.
Battle Group St. Aster, corrected Van Lescus. You belong to me now, Commodore.
Chapter 30. A Necessary Sacrifice. Skolos accepts. A way through the warp. No one told Skolos Evhavarad and the others that the mission would be fatal, but he knew it from the moment he was summoned to the St. Aster. He did not need to use his powers to read the disquiet around Commodore Athagay and her pair of aides as she gathered 20 of the strike group's navigators in the stateroom of her command deck and asked stern-faced for a volunteer. Skolos watched his fellows. 17 of the navigatorial houses were represented, their origins clear from their morphology as much as from their distinctive modes of dress. They all looked at each other. None of them spoke. None of them wanted to be the first to say no. Skolos took the lead. Someone had to say something.
My lady Commodore, he said.
His voice was high and raspy, the result of a mutation to his vocal cords. The deviation was so pronounced it was visible on his throat as a twisted knot, which he habitually covered with colourful cravats. He had always hated his voice. It made him sound like he had fallen into a helium tank, but he tried to imbue it with as much dignity as he could, and hide his loathing of the way he sounded with good manners and good humour.
I believe I must speak on behalf of all the navigators here,
he said. She looked at him, and he saw how tired she was, but her jaw was set with such determination.
We are not fools,
he said pleasantly.
This task will kill whoever takes it upon themselves.
He lifted his cane and flourished the top at his fellows. His hands too bore the stigma of change, each finger carrying an extra knuckle. Gloves hid this deformity from all but the most observant.
None of us here are of the highest grade, he said, but none of us are of the lowest either. We are navigators, qualified to the upper middle degrees of competence. Therefore, I assume the volunteer you require needs some skill, but not so much that they are indispensable to the fleet and to the crusade.
Athagay said nothing.
The 2 officers with you look uncomfortable, said Skolos. I suspect they appear that way because they have followed the same line of logic I have employed. They probably know little more of the nature of this mission than we do. That suggests to me that besides being dangerous, it is also very important. You have kept this secret to prevent the enemy learning of it, I believe, and if that is so, it must be vital.
Being a mistress of ships, Athagay had plenty of experience dealing with navigators. He could see that too. She didn't like it, though. Some captains hated their navigators, and they hated the fact that they had to rely on them even more. Athagay was an alien-loathing mutant hater. Her rectitude probably helped her forgive herself for her stim habit, he thought. For that was obvious too, in her red-veined eyes, clenched fists, and the glint in her pupils sharp enough to scratch steel.
What do you wish to gain from pronouncing all this, Navigator Evhavarad? She said coldly. There is no gain to be made here. This is an act of service to the Emperor, not a contract negotiation.
She did not refute what he had said. That was good enough for him.
I don't want anything,
he said.
I only wanted to be sure of the magnitude of what I was volunteering for.
He tapped the ferrule of his cane upon the decking.
Will you accept my service for the greater glory of the Imperium of Man and for he of Terra?
Her eyebrows rose.
You will do it, she said. I assume you will tell me no more until we are alone in this ship's sanctum?
Yes. The lines in her face softened. She had thought this was going to be harder.
It is my duty to do it.
He let his glances at the other navigators chastise them for their cowardice.
There is one advantage I seek from this, he said.
Athagay's face tightened again.
I said not for my house, but for me.
Skolos smiled his most charming smile.
I ask that you inform my house of the service I provided, and that I went to my death knowingly. I'm not regarded as pure enough to father children, he explained.
Although his mutations were minor, his house had been plagued with divergency of late, and their breeding codes had been tightened. He pulled off his glove with his teeth and curled his fingers so Athagay could see their deviation from sacred human normality, then tugged down his cravat to expose the ugly tumour at his throat.
I wish my name to be remembered with honour, and that I, Skolos Evhavarad, was a useful scion of my house. Despite these marks upon my body, my soul is pure.
She understood his motivation, and her sympathy for honour overcame her disgust at his mutations.
It shall be done, she said. Then I gladly accept this mission, whatever it may be.
Skolos's desire to do the right thing seemed an error when screaming out his last in the lead navigator's chair. The sanctum of the flagship was immense, the abode of a true lord, and the kind of domain Skolos had always coveted for himself. An immense armoured orb, 5 decks deep, and crammed with the kind of luxury the average imperial citizen could only dream of. When he came in and was accepted by Lord Navigator Sezolas, he allowed himself a small fancy that the manse was his, and that he had finally achieved his rightful place in the hierarchies of mankind. That moment of pleasure seemed very far away. The Centaster plunged down a warp current that threatened to wreck the ship. An infinite vortex of red and gold that twisted and eddied. From a certain perspective, it was beautiful. Any normal man who looked upon it would have been slain. There was a malice to the light that blackened the spirit, but that was not why Skolos screamed and screamed, his hated, stridulating voice made hoarse by hours of pain. Veins stood out all over his body. Sweat poured off him. His warp eye bled from the corners, and still he screamed. A machine of black stone and bright steel was set before him, the emanations it gave off caustic to the soul. He forced himself to look into its strange displays and follow the mote of agony that swung across them. There were seats for 6 additional navigators in the St. Aster's Navigatorium, a sign of the grim times they were in. He occupied the room's original central seat. The outermost 2 on the wings were occupied by navigators of menial rank. Their warp and human eyes were blindfolded against the sights Skolos must endure. They were there only to offer him a little strength, and even that minor effort might kill them. As was practice in the Indomitus Crusade fleets, 2 null maidens stood at silent attention at the front of the Navigatorium, blotting out the worst of the energies pouring through the oculus. Their presence hurt him too. To Skolos's warp sight, a searing light battled with depthless shadows, and both meant him harm. The pain was overwhelming. Fever raced through him. His heart ached. His throat was raw, and yet through it all he kept true to his task. "Look for a cyst in the warp," the Inquisitor Rostov had said, as he demonstrated the use of the device he had fabricated for the purpose of tracking the rift. "It is a blending of Empyrean and Materium, but with something at the edge of it, something hard, something alien, of neither realm. It will appear like nothing you have seen before. The machine I have provided will guide you, but it will kill you." He could give Skolos no more than that, because although he was a psyker himself, he was no navigator. Skolos found the wake of the Blackstone device sure enough, a slick like blood in the water where reality vomited its guts into the ever-hungry maw of the warp. Turbulence was intense, stirred up by the disintegration of gross matter and the formation of brief-lived actualities in the warp. The ship plunged and rolled dangerously. Through the warp oculus, Skolos could see nothing other than the raging energies given off by material dissipation. The storm was getting worse, and so was the pain. This was the surest sign they were on the right course. A small hardening of space rolled around the device's display, and he chased it. To him, the room was full of an awful roaring, but the adepts and other navigators working in the galleries behind side-screens and opaque active glass heard only his screams. It was not standard practice for others to be present while a navigator flew, but without a full post-rift cabal in place, and with Skolos nigh incoherent, they were needed to pass on locations to the other ships, all of whom were blind-linked to the St. Aster. On Skolos's head, the fate of the entire expedition depended. The burden gave him strength, even as his soul frittered away under the influence of the Blackstone machine. The St. Aster hit a wave front of intermixed matter and energy. She reared up so fast the grav plates could not hold her crew in place, and all over the vessel men and women were tossed about. The other ships followed, not all successfully. A firestorm frigate slewed around and broke amidships, flying into wreckage that spilled the screaming crew directly into the immaterium. Klaxons rang as pockets of clotted matter impacted upon the St. Aster. They exploded in displays of exotic energy, streaming distorted faces into the ship's wake. They were very close now. Skolos snapped his jaw shut so hard his teeth cracked. He held his screams in, though his chest convulsed as they attempted to get out. The machine was consuming him, body and soul. His skin was blackening. A storm of warp-broken matter sped past. The energy thinned. Through shifting veils, Skolos saw the blackness of true space and the stars that dwelled there. Ahead was a hellish glow, an aurora both crimson and angry, and at its heart was a thing, a ship, a god, a monster. It changed as he watched it. It was an eye staring at him. It was a taloned hand poised to snatch. It was an ancient vessel, towing behind it a great asteroid bearing an engine of stone. This last wavered. Knots of serpents and torrents of blood attempted to replace it, but of all the geysers the ship and the asteroid returned most frequently, and he focused on this, using the machine to force the true shape upon it, while his flesh burned under supernatural heat and flaked away from his bones in hard carbon showers. The engine was a whirling contraption of bladed blackstone, big as spires. There were 8 arranged around a central hub, the unholy octet of chaos. Though many hundreds of thousands of miles away, looking upon the asteroid somehow compressed the distance, and he thought he saw low hills raising up one end, machines and tiny figures walking around. Flocks of demonic creatures flew around it, soaring on thermals of energy, like scavenger birds following a corpse train. The spear-tip blades of the device sliced and bit, macerating the skin of reality and allowing the warp to spill out. It was not a clean cut, but a ragged tear that bled upwards. The blackness of the void folded into the rift like loose skin over a wound, and where these flaps touched the boiling warp, they evaporated with violent flashes of sorcerous discharge. This machine was what he had been following. Its presence in the warp was grit in his eye. It was the lump in the fabric of things that Rostov's device displayed. The rift grew wider as the ship sailed forward, half in real space, half in the warp, unzipping reality like a ration pack and scattering the contents carelessly. The vortex tugged at Skolos's soul, teasing it out of his body strand by strand and boiling it away, because he looked, because he saw. Something about it had hold of his immortal being, sucking it away. Trans, he breathed. His legs were collapsing into dust. His left arm came free of his chains as his hand shattered into a fall of black sand. He took one final deep breath, holding the screams in. His face flaked into ash, exposing his jawbone, creeping up towards his eyes. Translation! He screamed. Translation! The warp bell tolled in the apex of the navigatorium, and was answered by its twin upon the bridge. The men and women in the galleries behind the navigators' thrones sent out data pulses to every quarter, alerting machine spirits and crew to their duties. Translation! Skolos screamed. His disintegration spread up into his midriff. His clothes and muscles became friable dusts, showing guts that were only momentarily moist before they too became grainy sculptures of themselves and fell into nothing. His body caved into itself, and his head fell suddenly, leaving his gaping, skinless skull atop the heap of sand to jerk twice on the hinge of its jaw, then mercifully disintegrate into the pile. The mortal remains of Skolos trickled onto the floor, while outside the Gellerfield's demons screamed alarms. Battle Group St. Aster crashed back into the materium. Lightning flashed in the depths of the void where no lightning should be. A vivid red wound split the sky.
narrow near the leading edge, millions of miles wide further back, then wider yet, so wide it engulfed the stars, and black and screaming madness usurped the natural order of the heavens. An uncertain shape dragged out this hurt upon reality, flickering and treacherous of form, deceiving the eyes and the soul. But whatever shape it chose, it cut and split and chewed its way from one dimension to the next, letting out all the filthy hellscapes of the warp into the materium. Near the edge of the rift, a fresh breach opened, more controlled, short-lasting, a winking of purple and yellows, though just as corrupting to the rightful form of things. A bright patch flashed into being, spreading out tendrils of unlight, so that it resembled the radial muscles of a staring eye. From the hideous light a shape emerged, resolving from ragged edges to a silhouette against the storm, and became at last the St. Aster, speeding from the warp in such undue haste she tipped over her own prow and threatened to fly out of control. She avoided her stumble, yet wallowed in the backwash from the opening rift as she righted herself. Her sisters joined her in similar disarray, but as their numbers swelled, they brought themselves to order. Real space engines fired, and bright blue points of plasma burn shifted them into a cruciform formation, their engines shining with the clean light of science against the raging unreality of the warp. Coming light, Vox Lexica, Unmerciful, Faith's Promise, all the ships under Commodore Eloise Athegay's command. Together they sailed with all haste towards their sworn target, a spread of torpedoes racing before them, dense as spears cast by the armies of old Earth's primitive ages. But though they surprised their foe, they had been noticed. Chapter 31. Van Lescus lays her plan. A potent vessel returns. Fire at will. All hands, prepare for translation. The warning of the Precept Magnificat shipmaster sounded throughout the flagship. Lady Cassandra Van Lescus leaned into her pulpit over the strategium. "This is it," she said. "Prepare for battle. With the Emperor on our side, battle groups and Aster should be in position and ready to launch its assault." She smiled hungrily. "Time to take the fight to the enemy. Stand ready to activate all displays." Her strategos and aides repeated her orders, preparing their underlings for the great task ahead. Alarms wailed all over the flagship. The soul-troubling sense of transition passed fleetingly. So many ships were gathered in Van Lescus's attack group, the immaterium yielded them meekly back into the true void. The ship shuddered, and the oppressive sense of the warp left them. Another tremble, and a shout went up. "Transition accomplished. Gellerfields down. Void shields activated." The ship rumbled as the real space drives fired. Battle klaxons honked. "Enemy within sight." "All ships to battle stations," Van Lescus ordered. "Activate inter-ship noosphere and tactical linkages. Bring all displays online. Give me a true pict of the foe. Let's have a look at them." Machines all over the deck whined as they spooled up for action. The smaller displays came on first, showing the disposition of the three battle groups in her main group, the whole of Alphys and Bataris nearby, with Delpharis yet to enter play. After an initial skirmish, which Van Lescus commanded herself, Hephaestus was sailing to Fomor. Lambdax forged on to the north, to the worlds of more recent settlement that were hit early in the campaign. Smaller task forces went to the aid of embattled forces holding out elsewhere. Everywhere, the Crusade of Slaughter found itself under attack, each assault painstakingly coordinated to take place at the same time, or at least as close to each other as the warp would permit. Timing was everything in this fight. Alphys and Bataris emerged together, a single spear-tip assault led by 6 Imperial battleships. Van Lescus's Precept Magnificat held back, making a shaft to the spear with its escorts. Flanking and pursuit squadrons spread out in thin lines either side. This was shown on the smaller displays. The largest hololith came on last, spreading a colourful 3D true vid of the enemy fleet. There were a similar number of ships to Van Lescus's own, heading with overwhelming force through the Yancey system, and the 6 civilized worlds it contained. Van Lescus examined the enemy's disposition. They were mainly strung out, not in good formation, each group keeping to itself in the manner of warbands rather than a unified force. Each would require dealing with separately. They would favour boarding actions over ranged fighting. Some had become monsters, warped by the powers they served into beast machines. Others looked little different to similar ships in Imperial service. Only around a single Grand Cruiser was the fleet well organized, sailing in a large defensive formation that would prove tough to crack. Tags flickered over the display as the ships were identified. The Grand Cruiser's image blinked.
A green outline surrounded it. Blood King. Already, the enemy fleet was reacting, slowing to come to attack heading. Sound Void War Doctrine would have seen some of them press on to their original target, while the main body ran a holding action. But that supposed genuine strategic goals. These traitors desired only slaughter and war. The temptation of such a big battle was more than they could resist. All of them were coming about. She grinned. That was what she wanted. She opened Vox channels to all the fleet.
There we are. Everyone ready. Remember our goal today. Total annihilation. Let's give them an opening salvo from the Nova cannons. Stir them up a bit. There are 36 major warships in that fleet, ladies and gentlemen. I would be most grateful if you could destroy a few before they close. It makes my task all the easier.
Soft laughter greeted her comment.
Now, she chided. I'm being entirely serious. If we are victorious here, you will all be remembered forever. She smiled again. Well, I will. You'll all get honourable mentions. But nobody will be getting anything if we fail, except round cursing by the last few humans in existence, for our failure will leave Terra wide open to an attack directly from the Great Rift. I requested we leave first, not because of my faith in my own undeniable brilliance, but because I have unshakable faith in your abilities to bring us victory. So don't make me look bad. Let's be about it. To war!
All ships with Nova Cannon report full loads, Fleet Mistress, an aide informed her.
Then all captains may proceed with firing, she said.
As soon as Van Lescus gave the word, gargantuan railguns mounted on the prows of a dozen ships launched their payloads, accelerating volatile plasmic superwarheads down magnetic tracks to near the speed of light. Even at such a vast range, the weapons hit almost instantaneously. Fuses timed to the millisecond burned out and detonated the bombs. Sun-bright orbs of energy appeared in 24 places in the enemy fleet. Enemy vessels wallowed, systems overwhelmed by electromagnetic pulses. Void shields gutted out in washes of pseudo-starfire. Metal burned. Brief silhouettes of shattered debris were visible against the flames before they were engulfed and burned to atoms. Where the munitions scored direct hits, the effects were even more spectacular. There, the velocity of the shot did more damage than the devices. 3 cruisers vanished in blisters of light. The Nova Cannon shells blinked out, leaving after images on the eyes of all who watched the display.
All ships, reload, fire at will, Van Lescus said.
The number of shots would be down to the speed of each crew. She calculated that they might get 3 or 4 more volleys off before the enemy were too close. The sheer velocity of Nova Cannon munitions made them a long-range weapon only. Enemy fleet accelerating to attack speed, one of her strategos reported.
Hold back, 1/4 speed, Van Lescus said.
Her hololithic image was displayed on the command deck of every vessel.
Prepare first torpedo volley when enemy reach 200,000 mile marker. Alpha's task forces Principio, Thessian, and Incorrupt turn to broadside. Form gun line thereafter. Task forces Bombast and Vengeful to begin envelopment. Cast out mass shot screen behind. Battle group Bataris to prepare for mass attack run. Engage targets of discretion. You have your orders.
She had her own goals. Blood King raced at her, bringing with it the promise of glory. Boarding klaxons summoned the Primaris Marines to their attack craft. Arios and his men were among them. Messinius had a small force of Space Marines for his mission, but Van Lescus had ordered all the rest into the body of Alphas and Bataris, all tasked with boarding and counterboarding actions. Arios's group were to go on the attack, taking the fight to the enemy before they could launch their own boarding parties. His units filed aboard an Overlord gunship, a large new flying machine created by Call to carry his Primaris Space Marines into battle. It had 2 spacious transit hulls, one in each section of its double fuselage. Swept-down wings and the hunched cockpit between the twin hulls gave it the look of a raptor crouching over its prey. Weapons bubbles carrying crude heavy guns lined the outside of each hull, while the wings were tipped with Gatling las, and their broad spread played host to a myriad of missiles. Arios directed his men aboard. There were 40 to each bay. He and Lieutenant Kalinius commanded a near-complete demi-company each, 2 full squads apiece of Hellblasters and Intercessors, 3 units of 5 aggressors, and a command unit of Chaplain, Apothecary, Tech Marine, and Epistolary. Kalinius's group included the company Ancient. The standard bearer's title was in name only. They all regarded themselves as reborn, truly alive only for months. Boots clattered on the boarding ramps. The noise of interdiction fighters firing up their engines for test cycles sounded from their launch tubes a few hundred yards away. The hangar presented a wall of noise, and Arios was glad when the aggressors had lumbered aboard and he could follow. The prow and aft landing ramps whined closed, cutting out most of the racket from outside. Sparse talk came from the men as they checked each other's war gear. The occasional order and notification filtered into Arios's helmet. Mostly, "Hold! Hold!" Eventually, even this tailed off. The Space Marines locked their boots to the deck and secured their weapons to their chests with maglocks, then braced themselves against the man in front, left hand to left shoulder. Arios reviewed his mission objectives. Take the fight to the enemy, kill all he could, sabotage, cripple, and withdraw. Easy enough. He had never done it before, but had dreamed it 1,000 times. The Overlord rocked on its landing struts. Their cruiser had opened fire. It was an assault specialist designed for planetary attack and boarding actions. Therefore, its solid-shot weapons had a shorter effective range than most. The guns were less powerful, imparting less speed to its munitions, making them easier to shoot down. If they were firing, they were closing. "Be ready, brothers. We are going soon," he voxed. No one else spoke. They waited in the dim light of the combat lumens as the ship shook around them. Chapter 32. A Host of Demons. The Nature of the Foe.